It started with a voicemail I should have ignored. The ocean was loud that night, wind slapping against the glass, the same sound my wife used to call the world breathing. I'd just come home from the hospital. Her condition hadn't changed, but the doctor's tone had. When a man in his 50s hears words like, "Make her comfortable," he doesn't need translation. The machine blinked red. One new message. "Dad, don't freak out. I'm going with Matt to Hawaii for a few days. I just need a break. The hospital's too heavy. I'll call you when we land." The message ended with laughter, hers light and careless, and the distant voice of her boyfriend saying something about sunscreen. For a while, I just stood there, coat still on, sea water dripping from the cuffs. The kettle clicked behind me, overboiled. My wife had been fighting for her life that morning. My daughter was boarding a plane to paradise. The next morning, I sat by my wife's bed, holding her hand while the machines whispered. Her skin had gone pale, the freckles on her arms standing out like faded constellations. I told her about the weather, about the cat knocking over a vase. I didn't tell her about the message. She didn't need that kind of heartbreak. When visiting hours ended, I went home again. The house smelled of salt, coffee, and loneliness. Every corner carried her presence. The knitting basket by the chair, the half-read book by the lamp, her slippers by the bed. I couldn't bring myself to move them. 2 days later, my daughter posted a photo on social media. Bright sunlight. Palm trees. A cocktail in her hand. Caption: "Sometimes you have to live a little." The comments were full of hearts and emojis. I read them all, every one of them like a nail hammered into my chest. That night the doctor called. "Mr. Harris, I think you should come. It may be time." I drove like a ghost through the rain. The hospital was almost empty, corridors echoing with distant beeps. When I reached her room, she was awake barely. Her eyes found mine. "Is she coming?" she whispered. I lied. "She's on her way." My wife smiled faintly, the kind of smile people wear when they know the truth but forgive you for saying otherwise. She passed away before dawn. When I called my daughter, she didn't answer. Hours later, she texted, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'll book the next flight." She didn't. She came home 3 days later, tanned and laughing, suitcase rolling across the wet driveway like she was returning from a vacation, not a funeral. I watched her step out of the car, and for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize my own child. She looked around and frowned. "Dad, why didn't you wait for me to arrange things? Mom would have wanted." "Mom's gone," I said, voice flat. "She wanted you here." She bit her lip, eyes darting, guilt flashing for a second before pride covered it up. Matt's flight got delayed. I couldn't just leave him. I turned away. The sea outside roared like it was swallowing her excuses whole. That night, after everyone left, the neighbors, the casseroles, the murmured condolences, I sat alone in the dark living room. The surf pounded against the cliffs, steady as a heartbeat. My daughter's laughter drifted from upstairs, a phone call, probably to him. Something in me cracked. I looked at the family photo on the mantel. Me, her, and my wife, taken 5 years ago on this same beach. The man in that picture still believed in forgiveness. I don't know exactly when the anger settled into place, quiet and cold like fog rolling off the water. But I do remember the thought that followed it, clear as the tide hitting stone. She chose herself over her mother's last breath. And I chose, finally, to stop protecting her from the consequences of who she'd become. The morning after the funeral, the ocean was mercilessly bright. I made coffee I didn't drink. The house was filled with the faint scent of lilies, the kind people bring when they don't know what else to offer. My daughter came down the stairs barefoot, wearing one of her mother's sweaters, the sleeves too long for her arms. "Morning," she said softly, as if she was the one comforting me. "Morning," I answered, watching her pour coffee like nothing had changed. She sat at the table and started scrolling her phone. I waited for something, regret, apology, maybe tears. But all I heard was the faint clicking of her nails on glass. Finally, I asked, "Do you want to visit your mother's grave today?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I can't, Dad. Not yet. It's too raw." I nodded slowly. An hour later, when she went to take a call outside, I saw her reflection in the window, laughing again. By afternoon, she was in the living room, flipping through paperwork. "You didn't sign anything yet, right?" she asked. "What paperwork?" "The estate stuff. The house, Mom's savings, her jewelry." She looked up from the folder with that impatient expression she'd inherited from me. "It's all gonna get messy if we don't file things properly." Something inside me tightened. "Your mother's body isn't even buried yet, Emily." "I know, but the bills won't wait. And you've still got the mortgage, right?" Her tone was calm, logical, like she was talking about car repairs, not death. I stared at her for a long time. "You think I care about bills right now?" She sighed, closing the folder. "You always get emotional about this stuff." "I'm just trying to be practical." Practical. That was the word she used when she left for Hawaii, too. That night, I went through my wife's belongings, not to divide them, but to remember. A scarf still smelled like her perfume, faint and comforting. A small notebook by the bed, her handwriting shaky but neat. On the last page she'd written, "Emily's lost. Don't let anger take her too." I closed the book and sat in the dark. The sound of waves filled the silence again. My wife always believed people could find their way back. I wasn't so sure anymore. 3 days later, Emily brought her boyfriend over. Matt, tall, polished, all smiles. He offered me a hand like we were business partners. "Mr. Harris, I'm so sorry for your loss." He said it while looking around the house, eyes pausing on the paintings, the furniture, the view. Emily trailed behind him, avoiding my gaze. "We were thinking," she began carefully, "maybe you shouldn't stay here alone. The house is too big, and you're not getting any younger. You could sell it, move into a condo near Portland. Close to everything." Matt nodded. "You'd make a great profit, sir. These coastal properties are gold right now." I looked from him to her. "This house," I said slowly, "was your mother's dream. She picked this cliff because she said she wanted to fall asleep to the ocean every night." Emily's expression hardened. "Yeah, but Mom's gone. You don't need to cling to the past." Matt smiled, like this was some kind of negotiation. "If you want, I can help with the sale. I know people in real estate." I didn't answer. I just stood up, walked to the window, and let the silence hang until it turned heavy. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "You two should leave. Now." Emily's eyes widened. "Dad, now?" They left without another word. That night she sent me a text. "You're being dramatic. Mom wouldn't want you angry at me. I was just trying to help." The next morning, she came by again, this time alone. No apologies, just a new tactic. "I talked to the lawyer," she said, sitting down across from me. "He said Mom didn't update her will after buying the house. Technically, half of it's mine." "Technically," I said. "Your mother trusted you not to turn grief into greed." Her face flushed. "That's not fair. You think I don't care she's gone? I just, what?" She looked down. "I just need money, okay? Matt lost his job. We're behind on rent." There it was. The truth, raw and small. "You flew to Hawaii while your mother was dying," I said quietly. "And now you're standing in her house asking for money." Tears welled in her eyes, but not the kind that come from guilt, the kind that come from losing control. "You always twist everything. Mom would have helped me. Maybe. But she's not here anymore. And neither is the version of you she believed in." She grabbed her purse and stormed out. The door slammed. The sound echoed through the empty house like thunder. That evening, I found myself driving to the bluff where my wife and I used to walk. The sky was violet, waves breaking far below. The wind carried the scent of rain and pine. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I thought about what my wife wrote in her notebook, Don't let anger take her too. But anger wasn't taking her. She'd already given herself away, piece by piece, to comfort, vanity, and whatever Matt represented. When I returned home, her car was parked outside again. The lights in the living room were on. Inside, she was packing things into boxes, her mother's things. Rings, scarves, trinkets. "What are you doing?" She didn't even look up. "These were Mom's. I have a right to some memories, don't I?" "Memories?" I stepped closer. "You don't box up memories, Emily. You earn them by being there." She froze, then said coldly, "You think I don't feel bad? I can't change what happened." "No," I said. "But you can stop pretending it didn't." For a long moment, we stood there, two strangers in the ruins of a family. Then she left again, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. The next morning, I found a message on the answering machine, from the same lawyer she mentioned. "Mr. Harris, I understand there's some confusion about the estate. Emily has asked for clarification regarding joint property rights." I replayed it twice. Then once more, just to make sure I heard right. It wasn't confusion. It was betrayal, clear, deliberate, and planned. That night, sitting by the window with the storm outside, I realized something simple but sharp as glass. If she wanted to treat this like a transaction, I'd make sure it ended like one. And when it was done, she'd learn the cost of turning love into currency. For 2 days I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I pretended to sleep badly. I pretended to sign condolence cards. I answered questions with the same small, measured sentences you learn to use when the world has narrowed to a single, raw fact. Inside, I was doing something I'd never done before. I was thinking like someone who had nothing left to lose. My wife had always been the organizer, the index cards, the color-coded calendars, the passwords memorized on a sticky note in her wallet. When she died, 1,000 small things lost their anchor. I started with those. The first thing I did was go through the mail. Not because I was nosy, but because small details hide in envelopes: an old prescription refill, a billing statement, a letter from a utility. A week of bills revealed nothing overt, just hospice invoices, a few subscription renewals. Then I found the credit card statements in the junk drawer, the cheap filing spot people use for things they think they'll sort later. Her name on the top of each page. I skimmed for anomalies, large withdrawals, gifts, airline charges. There it was, a charge for 2 airline tickets to Honolulu, dated 2 days after she called me from the hospital to say the doctor had made her comfortable. The charge was under Emily's name. The vendor, a travel site. The billing address, our house. I stared at the numbers until the kitchen lights started to blur. I took a deep breath, folded the papers, and walked to the shelf where my wife kept a shoebox of things: recipes, condolence cards, and one old Polaroid of my daughter asleep on my wife's lap when she was 6. I put the statements beside the photo and felt the two truths press against each other like coin halves. If Emily had booked those tickets while Mom was dying, it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The idea of calling her and demanding an explanation crossed my mind and left instantly. Anger makes people loud. My design needed silence. I needed proof. I needed a pattern. That afternoon I called James, the lawyer I'd known for 30 years. He'd once helped me straighten out a small business contract, and later, my wife and I had invited him to Thanksgiving when his wife was out of town. He picked up on the second ring. "James," I said, "I need to ask you for something discreet." There was a pause, then his careful, "Is everything all right, Tom?" He always called me Tom in public and Thompson in documents. I liked that. It felt like continuity. "No," I said. "Not really. But that's not the point. I need access to Emily's messages, call logs, and any statements she's tried to file about the estate. I don't want trouble, I want clarity." He was quiet for a beat, then practical. "You know I'll do what I can. I can send a letter requesting records. If there's anything shady, we can subpoena. But that takes time." He didn't say it outright, but I heard the subtext: Legal gears grind slower than pain. Time. I thought about that word. The tide cares nothing for our timetable. The thing about justice is that if you wait for an institution to hand it to you, people walk away with whatever they can carry. So get me whatever you can without a lawyer's letter, I said. I need people who can look where I can't. He sighed, the breath of a man who understood both grief and the quality of slow things. I'll make a few calls. Give me an outline of what you think is wrong. I told him the airline charge. I told him about the realtor's smile. I told him about the lawyer's tentative voicemail and Emily's casual packing of things the day after the funeral. He offered a name, a man he trusted, Tomas Raines, private investigator. Small, local, with more patience than glamour. He's decent, James said. He'll find details without making a mess. 2 days later Tomas came by. Not the trench coat detective of movies, but a man in a rainproof jacket with a kind, tired face and a notepad. He didn't sit until I offered him coffee. He asked few questions, and when he did they were surgical: dates, times, names. People make mistakes when they think they're being clever, he said. They overshare. They use debit cards, they message people from their real phones, and sometimes they forget to switch accounts. Give me a week. I gave him a list. Emily, Matt Harris. No, that was our name. Matt Collins, the realtor's name, the lawyer who'd sent the voicemail. In the box where my wife kept passwords, I found an old sticky with the note, Emily Pay 12, likely a shared account name. I wrote it down and handed it to Tomas. At night, while the house breathed and the waves kept time, I mapped a strategy on paper. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a ledger of small actions. Secure documents, original will, recent statements. Preserve evidence, text messages, flight confirmations, receipts. Legally freeze any suspicious transfers, through James. Expose motives publicly if needed, but only after proof. Teach Emily what it feels like to have choices taken from her. I was careful about the language. I did not use words like punish. I told myself I wanted correction and closure. In private, the words simmered: accountability. Within 4 days, Tomas called. He'd done a small sweep. Emily had charged several hotel stays, some refunds, some full payments, and dozens of purchases that matched the trip's timeline. But there was more: a transfer to Matt's account 2 weeks before Mom's final hospital stay, and a set of texts between Emily and Matt that had a tone that made my stomach turn. Not just casual affection, a transactional negotiation about what we can get, and how to make it look legit. Tomas sent me copies. I read them on the kitchen table, a single lamp turning the words into punctured paper. The messages were careful, almost clinical. Keep this quiet. We can say urgent family matter. I'll handle the realtor. Meet me Thursday. The language was not the tone of grief. It was the tone of a plan being implemented. I called Emily. She didn't pick up. I sent a text: we need to talk. Now. She replied quickly: I can't. Busy. Call later. Later never came. I started visiting places Emily and Matt had been: the coffee shop near the marina where Matt worked remotely, the property office where the realtor's card bore a crooked smile. I watched them, not like someone stalking but like someone checking facts. Matt arrived in a suit one afternoon, carrying a tablet that displayed house listings with glossy photos. He looked like a man who'd been rehearsing belonging. One afternoon he met me at the kitchen table as if there were nothing between us. Mr. Harris, he said, with a distracted charm, we should talk about selling. I know a buyer who'd pay top dollar. You were at a job interview last month, I said. You told my neighbor you were doing freelance work. He didn't flinch. Things move fast in real estate, he said. You don't have to manage everything. Emily stressed. You were in my kitchen the day after Mom died asking about the mortgage. The sentence landed like a stone. He had no answer prepared. There was a kind of calm that lives on the other side of rage. It's not colder, it's more focused. I could have confronted him then, called him a thief, made a scene. Instead, I asked a single question. If I look at your bank records, what will I see? He smiled thinly. You wouldn't see anything unusual. We pay our bills. We're finishing some renovations. You took money from my wife's account. The words came out steadier than I felt. I have records showing transfers. The smile left his face. The first crack showed when his jaw worked like a man learning to swallow a lie. You've got to be mistaken. You could prove me wrong. I folded my hands and let the silence do what my voice could not. He left without another word. I watched the door close and felt an odd relief. The first lie had been named. That night I sat in my wife's chair and felt for the first time the surreal quality of having to choose between sorrow and action. My hand found the notebook on the side table, the last page, the faded instruction, find patience. Don't be cruel. I read it until the letters blurred. I did not want to be cruel. I wanted the truth. So I prepared to get it, piece by piece, with the kind of patience my wife had taught me. I would not let grief be the excuse that covered her betrayal. I would not let her dodge responsibility because she looked small and pretty in a vacation photo. By the end of the week, James had filed a request to the bank for transaction histories and a notice to any realtor involved that there might be an estate claim. Tomas had a small folder of texts and receipts that painted a picture, not yet complete, but damning in tone. I began to see the structure of it. The trip was not escape. It was cover. The realtor was a linchpin. The lawyer's voicemail had been a probe. I slept less, not because I wanted to, but because the plan required daylight, and daylight was where other people moved. The darker hours were mine for thinking. On the 10th day after the funeral, I did something practical and unnerving. I called my daughter's phone and let it ring until it went to voicemail. I played it back and listened to her voice, the way she laughed, and then cut it short when a man's voice said, "Hurry up, we're boarding." It was a moment of proof and also proof of character. When I hung up, I felt a clarity that was almost surgical. The choice I had made was not born from spectacle. It was a slow, deliberate pivot from being a man who forgave to a man who enforced consequences. I would not take her money, not in the petty way some men do. I would take away her advantage, the sense that she could rearrange the dead into profit. I would show her the cost of reducing a person to ledger lines. And I would do it without shouts. Quiet, precise, and public enough that she couldn't hide behind charm or excuses. In the end, I wanted her to know, with the same certainty I had when I held my wife's hand in the night, what it means to answer for what you choose. "You kept this to yourself, Tom?" James asked when I handed him the folder across his desk. The office smelled like old leather and coffee. "I didn't want it to leak," I said. "Leaks help people disappear." He flipped through the pages, then looked up. "You understand the bank can push back. They don't like being accused of letting money flow without signs." "I don't want them to accuse," I said. "I want them to freeze. Just temporarily. Enough to make them squirm." James nodded slowly. "If the transfers are there, and they look like predatory behavior, we can get an injunction on new transfers and a notice put on any property listings. But you'll need a clear timeline. We have to prove intent, not just clumsiness." "Intent," I repeated. The word tasted like iron. Tomas arrived that afternoon with a manila envelope and the kind of look that tells you he'd been on his feet for days. "I followed Matt for 2 weeks," he said, dropping the envelope on my kitchen table. "He's careful, but not that careful. Fans of convenience leave trails." He pulled out printouts, receipts, a list of names, a cache of messages. "These show regular payments into a shell account. The flight is one thing, this is the system." Emily's name was on a line item that matched an expensive gift from a jewelry store 2 days after Mom went to the hospital. Matt's account had a suspicious deposit that matched the airline transaction. The math threaded them together. "That's not enough for the court to freeze a house," James said. "But it's enough for an investigator to keep digging. We need bank witnesses, receipts tied to the accounts, and corroboration from the realtor." The realtor will fold if you threaten a professional ethics complaint, Tomas said. He's not clean, Tom. He's sloppy. He left a paper trail that connects him to Matt. I felt a cold sort of pleasure at that. Not revenge, logistics. If someone was going to profit, they'd have to be clever. This man was only clever enough to think he was clever. We set tasks. James filed the early motions, a notice of potential estate litigation and a request to banks for transaction histories. Tomas would dig into Matt's contracts and interview the realtor under the pretense of an interested buyer. I would do the inconvenient things, call neighbors, read through old voicemail, and sit in the coffee shop where Matt worked, pretending to be a man who liked gloomy espressos. One of Tomas's calls turned up something I hadn't expected, an email trail between Matt and a local buyer, a contractor named Eric Rhodes, who was eager to move fast on any coastal property. Fast, Tomas said, can mean under the table. That gave me an idea. Build an irresistible, legal bait, a buyer who would offer a high cash price, but only if the house could close quickly. Make sure the buyer's interest is public enough to bring Emily into motion. Let her greed and impatience override caution. Then, when she moved as expected, have James and the bank step in with a legal freeze. The trap wouldn't be cruelty. It would be the natural consequence of her choices in the light. Setting bait felt oddly like theater. I didn't relish the role, but I knew every play needs its stagehands. Tomas and I made contact with Eric Rhodes. He was precisely as eager as the emails suggested, a contractor with cash and a reputation for closing on hot leads. I can bring an investor, he told me. He'll pay full market. He asked, offhand, about disclosures and transfer times. I listened and learned. He assumed we wanted to sell. I'll make an offer, I told him. But not yet. We need Emily to act first. We arranged an open house. Not by lying, the house was technically on the market in the way that grief makes people list what they no longer want, but we pushed the listing forward in a controlled manner. Eric's interest was real. He'd been to other viewings, but his offer we kept purposely conditional. We let word leak through the realtor and through neighborhood grapevine. There's a buyer, someone local, offers are coming. Emily would be tempted to speed things along. Meanwhile, James and I tightened legal screws. He filed a preliminary notice of intent to contest transfers based on suspicious activity, and requested the bank place alert holds on any property transfers involving our account numbers. Those holds are dry legal things, paperwork, calls, quiet alarms inside bank systems. They do not shout. They whistle when someone tries to move money. On a rainy Wednesday, Tomas called me. He's got his patterns, he said. Matt uses a portfolio manager for some accounts, but he's also funneling smaller transactions through Venmo-like apps. He pays contractors cash, then moves funds to Matt's primary. If we can show that sequence, the bank will cooperate. Can you get the contractor to confirm? I asked. Eric? Tomas grinned in a way that made me uneasy. Eric's an easy mark. He wants to close too. I offered to connect him with an investor if he cooperated. He will. So Eric became our unsung actor. He'd present a clean, above-board front. He'd show our realtor, who was now more exposed than he knew, that there was real, attractive cash on the table. Emily would see that and try to shortcut normal processes. She'd be impatient. She'd want to control the sale. One night, I sat with the house documents, the original deed, a typed will from years ago that left everything to my wife with a residuary clause that placed property in our joint ownership unless amended, and a set of sticky notes in my wife's handwriting that mentioned names like Emily, watch out. In a way that wasn't accusing, it was protective. I felt strange handling it, like rearranging bones. At the hardware store down the street, Tomas and I bought a small recorder and a device that lets you mirror a phone's audio if you own it. He was careful with the wiring. I pretended I knew nothing while he installed something in the living room lamp. You sure? I asked. He shrugged. People talk to their phones. They reveal patterns. Your daughter's careless on calls when she thinks she's safe. I left the lamp where my wife used to sit. For 3 days nothing happened. I almost let the lull make me soft. That would have been a mistake. A plan is a brittle thing, it breaks if you stop tending it. Then Emily called me, the first time she'd initiated conversation in a week. "Dad," she said, as if trailing her voice through water. "They've got a buyer." Eric called. "He's serious. He'll close fast if we lower the price a little. It'll sell before the next inspection window." I could hear Matt in the background, his murmuring confidence like a radio left on. "We should list at a bit lower to make it move," Emily said. "It'll be fine. We can go pick a condo. You can be near doctors and people." This was the moment the trap needed, her appetite for speed. "What's the offer?" I asked. She paused. "It's good. Cash. Enough. Eric said he could have the funds by Friday if we accept." "Friday." I kept my voice level. "You should let James handle the paperwork." "I don't want to wait," she snapped. "We've waited long enough." She hung up. I called Eric the next morning. "Are you still interested?" I asked. He was. "If you can make an offer this week, I'll consider it." On paper, everything was above board. Eric signed a formal offer, a clean PDF, earnest money shown, bank references attached. We took the earnest deposit to the realtor and asked to set a quick close. The realtor's eyes glittered. He saw a commission. His phone lit up with the taste of profit. But before we could exchange keys, James sent the bank a copy of the paperwork and the evidence Tomas had gathered. The bank placed a temporary hold on any transfer until they could verify the origin of the funds. The realtor received notice that an estate claim might interfere with closing. Legal language does something to men who live by deals, it makes them nervous. I watched Emily at the kitchen table the moment she learned there was a hold. Her face went an odd color, not red, but a paler, animal kind of panic. "What do you mean they put a hold?" she asked Matt when he came over. He tried to be calm. "Maybe a clerical issue. We'll call James. We'll get it cleared." James wasn't moved by panic. He had his legal stance. We'd filed for clarification based on suspicious transfers and a potential undue influence claim. "The bank is doing the right thing," he told them, polite and solid as a court bench. "They need to ensure the funds are clean." That afternoon, a local reporter from the community paper called James asking if it was true there was an estate dispute over the old Harris property. I'd not intended for a reporter to get wind of it, but someone in the realtor's office leaked the possibility. Greed rustles its own leaves. The paper ran a short piece. "Local estate dispute may delay coastal property sale." It was a small paragraph, nothing dramatic, but it reached neighbors and curious buyers. It reached friends who had once admired my wife's garden and now watched with a different interest. Emily's panic changed tack the next day. She tried persuasion, which quickly turned into bargaining, and then into accusation. "You're ruining my life," she said in a scream that woke the cat. "You're using Mom's death to control me." "You could have been here," I said. "You chose not to be." She tried social pressure next, calling a sister-in-law, a friend who was our neighbor, someone who might shame me into backing down. The calls didn't help. People are kind in private, cautious in public. The trap tightened in ways I hadn't fully predicted. The bank held. Eric's investor began to hesitate because of the notice. The realtor's emails grew jittery. The community dug a small, collective curiosity into something they'd once ignored. It was not vengeance yet. It was a net being drawn at the sea's edge. Emily flailed, and the sea took the corners of her plans. On a Thursday night, Tomas came in with 2 new sets of documents. "I've got Matt on a record," he said. He talked to the realtor about wiring the earnest money through a mobile payment and then splitting it as a consulting fee to an LLC. He called it a buffer. That's a red flag. "Show me." I read the transcript. The word buffer looked like sugar masking poison. "You're sure you want to go public?" Tomas asked. "This will destroy some people's lives, maybe more than they deserve." The question landed heavy. The man who'd been planning slowly and carefully had not become immune to the moral cost. It was a real question. I felt my wife's handwriting in my head again. Don't be cruel. I folded the paper, put it in the folder, and answered him honestly. This isn't about destroying them for spite, I said. This is about making sure they can't profit from something they treated like a bargain. If we expose the system, the quick sales, the buffers, the accounts, maybe they'll think twice before treating people like inventory. Tomas didn't smile, but he understood. He slid the documents into an envelope marked for James. We set the final step, timing. The open house had gotten the town's attention, the bank had placed a hold, Eric's investor had grown nervous but not yet walked away, and the realtor was sweating commissions. We scheduled a meeting for Friday. 2 lawyers, a bank representative, and the realtor there to discuss the close. I'd asked James to invite the bank's compliance officer. I wanted the attempt at a quick sale to be witnessed by people who could verify motive, funds, and procedure. Then I did something small and surgical. I printed copies of every text conversation and every transfer and put them in an envelope addressed to Emily. I left it on the kitchen table where she could see it when she returned from work. I wanted the moment she found it to be ordinary, a stack of papers with facts. No shouting, no theatrics. A mirror. When she came home and saw the envelope, she went white. She touched the paper like it might bite. "Dad, what is this?" she whispered. "Facts," I said. "You can ignore them or you can answer. I prefer the latter." She sat on the floor and started to read. I stood in the doorway and listened to the quiet rustle of pages and the small, private sound of denial cracking. We were ready. The trap was not cruel in design. It relied on systems, banks, lawyers, honest contractors, and one man who wanted to buy a house and had cash enough to sway greed. It relied on the fact that when people choose expediency over mourning, they forget the slow work of truth. When everything is ready, the execution is simple. It's not fireworks. It's a door opening at the right moment and the light spilling in. I felt the plan in my bones like a tide preparing to come in. Friday would decide if Emily's choices were costly. If she tried to override the hold, the bank would show the transfers. If she attempted to manipulate the realtor, the lawyer would explain the implications. If she lied in public, the records would speak. I went to bed that night feeling neither triumphant nor vengeful. I felt like a man who'd finally stopped floating and had dug a stake into the ground. The world was cold, and the ocean was steady. The next day would be when the consequences arrived. Friday morning smelled like rain and litigation. I woke early, boiled coffee until it tasted thin and sharp, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder James had given me. Outside, the ocean was a leaden sheet. When grief and calculation sit in the same room, the air tastes like metal. James arrived in a plain suit, no flourish, just the steady presence of a man who knows courtrooms and paperwork. Tomas came separately, eyes like a man who hadn't slept in days but had learned how to look harmless. Eric Rhodes was due to arrive any minute with his investor. The realtor, Greg, already had the look of a man who'd rehearsed charm until it felt like a mask. Emily came in last, hair pulled back, phone in hand. She walked like a person who believes the world will accommodate her if she asks loudly enough. Matt followed, polite in a way that made me think of actors who memorize empathy. We met in the living room, where my wife's chair still sagged in her shape. James introduced the bank compliance officer, a woman named Dana who had the tone of someone whose job is to be polite and terrifying. She carried a tablet and a folder the color of courthouse paper. "Thank you all for coming," James said. "We're here to discuss the intended transfer and sale of the Harris property, and some question marks that have risen in the process." Greg brightened. "This is routine. An estate query can be cleared in a day. We have an investor ready to close, earnest money in deposit. And we want the opportunity to review those funds." Dana interrupted gently. She turned the tablet so everyone could see a timeline: deposits, transfers, shell account movements. When an account shows rapid, layered transfers and payments into third-party accounts tied to interested parties. Compliance flags it for review. It's standard. Matt's smile thinned. This is just a clerical thing. We can provide documentation showing the fund's origin. He sounded practiced. Tomas slid a stack of printouts across the table. These are texts and receipts that show a sequence of behavior consistent with funneling and buffer transfers. There's a transfer from Mrs. Harris's credit to Matt's account, then a consulting payout to an LLC, and then an apparent earnest money move. It's not illegal yet, he added quickly, but it's suspicious enough to warrant a hold. Emily's face went pale. That's not true. She flipped through the pages like the facts might combust and reveal a different truth. Her hands trembled. James watched her with the cool patience of a judge. Mrs. Harris's account shows a payment for airline tickets and associated hotel charges initiated while she was hospitalized. We're not here to cast blame arbitrarily. We're here to make sure the estate is handled properly. Until the bank verifies the origin of funds and confirms there's no undue influence, they have the right, and duty, to hold transfers. Dana nodded. We've placed a temporary compliance hold pending verification. We'll need bank statements from the sources of the earnest money and corroboration that any consulting fees reflect arm's-length transactions. Greg's phone buzzed. He read a text and his expression shifted from smile to sweat. He muttered something and then tried to be jocular. Look, Tom, Mr. Harris, this is all paperwork. We can work through it. The investor will wait if we explain. Eric, who had arrived with a small man in an overcoat I vaguely recognized from community meetings, spoke up. My investor is patient, but he doesn't like risk. If there's a cloud on title or legal dispute, it complicates things. It was at that moment I realized how thin the curtains of their confidence had been. They'd been relying on speed, on the momentum of convenience. The bank's hold made the momentum an asset that could be turned into evidence. Emily launched into a plea. Dad, please. This is my house too. Mom wanted me to have it. We can work this out. Don't turn this into something public. Public? Tomas said softly. There's nothing public about holding someone accountable for suspicious transfers. Accountability is private until someone refuses to listen. She looked at me then, and something in her broke, not the theatrical break of a child pretending, but a raw, exposed fissure. You're doing this on purpose, she whispered. You're enjoying this. I felt the words, younger than they should have been. I am not enjoying it, I said. I'm doing what I should have done when I realized what was happening. Mom never would have allowed this, she said. She loved you. She loved me. She loved you enough to teach me to keep a record, I answered. She left notes. She left instructions. She wanted truth to matter. Matt's hand found Emily's under the table. He squeezed like a man willing to be brave by proxy. We can fix this, he said. We'll get the right paperwork. There are explanations for transfers. Dana looked at the documents Tomas had provided and then at her tablet. If the transfers are substantiated and lawful, the hold will be lifted. But if we find structured payments designed to obscure the source of funds, that's a red flag for undue influence, or even fraud. That's when compliance refers matters to law enforcement for investigation. The word sat in the room cold as a rock. Matt's jaw worked. Greg's eyes darted to the door. Emily's breath came shallow and fast. James closed his briefcase and leaned forward. There's also the matter of potential undue influence. If Mrs. Harris was in a vulnerable state and assets were moved to benefit a party that exercised influence over her decisions, that's a civil and potentially criminal concern. That's why we asked for bank statements, and why the bank has a duty to investigate. What do you want? Emily cried. Her voice was animal now. What do you want from me? I want the truth, I said. I want what rightfully belongs to your mother's estate to be respected. I want the record to be clear. I want you to be accountable. The investor cleared his throat. We can wait, he said, voice small. But time is money. Then wait. I replied. Wait until the bank does its job. Greg finally spoke, and his voice lacked the practiced bluster it had before. This will cost us. If there's a dispute, we may miss buyers. Commission. He stopped, because no one cared about commissions when the law sat in the room like a clock. The meeting wound down with the bank promising a full review, James promising to cooperate, and Tomas handing over more of his files. Emily left the house in a daze, phone clutched to her ear, words tumbling that I could not make out. Matt followed, jaw set. Greg stayed behind to call his office, to rug sweep in his mind, to calculate. After they were gone, James turned to me. You understand this could escalate to law enforcement if the bank finds structured transactions meant to conceal the source of funds. I understand. The sentence was a simple one. Say it enough and the heart learns to steady. 2 days later the bank called with a preliminary finding. The hold would remain. The transfer pattern showed what they called multiple layering, through third-party accounts and a consulting LLC tied to a vendor Matt had used. The bank compliance officer, after a quiet internal review, recommended a referral for potential criminal review. That word, criminal, sounded enormous in my ears, like the ocean when it throws up something from the deep. When the detective from the county called, he was polite and slow. We'll need to interview Emily and Matt. This is preliminary. It may amount to nothing, but we have to pursue any credible lead. Emily's first reaction was denial. This is ridiculous, she told the detective on speakerphone while I sat at the table and listened. There's a misunderstanding. Her voice frayed like a thread near the end. Then came a detail that felt like a hammer. Matt, when pressed, admitted he'd suggested the consulting fee and the LLC as a way to buffer the earnest money. He said the word buffer with the casual arrogance of someone who thought cynicism was clever. The county prosecutor's office opened a file. There were small consequences first, a freeze on accounts, an interview where I watched my daughter sweat under the county detective's careful questions, neighbors watching from porches like an audience in a slow play. There were larger ones in the weeks after. Greg's office received a professional standards inquiry after it came to light that he hadn't fully disclosed related party relationships. Eric's investor withdrew, spooked by the cloud on title and the new legal attention. I will not pretend that the exposure was clean or painless. It wasn't. Emily lost not just the chance to push the sale through quickly, she lost friends who preferred not to be tangled in legal messes. Matt's opportunities dried up. The romance of convenience evaporated like mist. One morning, a month after the hold, Emily sat at the kitchen table with tears she had not allowed before. Not theatrical ones, but small, exhausted things. I didn't think it would go this far, she said. I didn't think. Her voice broke on the small words. I was scared. You left while your mother was dying, I said. You chose the sun instead of the room. Then you tried to make profit of decisions that affected someone who couldn't decide for herself. You chose. Tears came faster. I know I made a mistake. She looked so young then, like the girl in the Polaroid, not the woman who'd booked a flight. I'm sorry. Sorry is the start, I said. Not the end. You have to answer for what you did. That's not cruelty. That's being an adult. The detectives' interviews went on. There were legal hearings where depositions were taken and where you could see adrenaline and cheap lies evaporate under oath. Matt, when confronted with text messages and bank records, shrank. He had the option to plead ignorance, but the messages showed negotiation and direction. In the end, he struck a deal to avoid the worst charges, cooperate, return funds where possible, and accept a misdemeanor for financial misconduct. Greg lost his license for a season after the professional board found he'd acted negligently. Eric, embarrassed, settled a civil claim quietly. Emily faced the civil consequences, an agreement to restore certain funds to the estate, community service to a hospice charity her mother had loved, and a period of supervision where she would not be the sole decider of the property. The house remained in limbo while the courts sorted claims and intentions. I do not take pleasure in the damage to their lives. Some nights I replay my wife's last writing about patience and think about how close I came to becoming the very thing she warned against. But I'd promised her the truth. I'd promised not to let what she'd built be rearranged into somebody else's ledger. When the legal fog cleared enough, the judge's final order put the house into a temporary trust for the benefit of the estate with a guardian appointed to manage the property until a final decision. The judge's language was brisk and careful. Undue influence, where shown, invalidates a transaction. That line felt like a small justice. It did not bring back my wife. It did not erase the vacation photos. But it did make evident that choices have consequences. On the day the judge signed the order, Emily sat in the back of the courtroom with hollow eyes. We did not speak afterward, not then. In the car she curled into herself and let tears fall so quietly I could have mistook them for rain. That night, I went down to the beach alone. The ocean threw silver at the shore. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty and tired, like someone who'd carried a weight up a cliff and set it down, only to see the view was different than he'd imagined. Justice was not a bomb. It was an alignment of facts and responsibility. A neighbor knocked on my door a week later with a casserole and 2 words. "You did right." I smiled because a smile is easier than the litany I believed. Truth, community, law, they had converged, awkward and clumsy, but they'd converged. Emily eventually moved into a small apartment inland. She kept some of the jewelry, but it seemed heavy to her when she put it on. She called less. When she did call, we spoke stiffly about mundane things, insurance, a mechanic, the cat. The intimacy that had once been easy now required care. That was part of the consequence I wanted. She would have to rebuild a life honestly, not on shortcuts. Matt's calls stopped after the plea. I never heard his rehearsed charm again. He sent one message, "I'm sorry." That was all. Some apologies are short, they mean less because they arrive after the fact. I did not tell the media everything. I let the local paper tell what it needed, a story about a disputed estate, a cautionary note about quick sales, the reminder that grief can be preyed upon. I let it be small. Public shaming is a blunt instrument. The point was not humiliation. The point was accountability. When people asked me if I regretted the way things had unfolded, I answered honestly. I regret the hurt. I would say. I regret that my daughter made choices that caused pain. I regret that my wife died and left us so raw that we could be tempted into terrible things. But I do not regret ensuring her wishes and the estate were respected. That last line is not an attempt at moral bragging. It's an admission. The justice I sought was not to make Emily vanish. It was to ensure she learned the scale of consequence. The island photos, the tan, the laughter, those were not sins by themselves. The sin was the choice to treat a dying body like a ledger. When the papers finally closed and the legal smoke cleared enough for me to breathe, Emily came by once more. She stood in the doorway like someone who had rehearsed how to be small and sorry. "Dad," she said, "I'm trying to be better." I looked at her, at the girl with my wife's eyes and my own mouth. "I know," I said. "That's the thing. Try. Don't expect forgiveness as payment. Earn it." She nodded, and for the first time in months, I felt something like recognition. It was not the easy, naive warmth of the past. It was a guarded, cautious thing. Like a plant that takes months to put out new leaves after a hard winter. The trap had worked. The records had spoken. The systems, bank compliance, a patient lawyer, an investigator who watched patterns, had done what they were meant to do when someone pushed too hard against mercy. It was not a perfect victory. It was a necessary one. I did not celebrate. I made a small dish of the casserole the neighbor had left, and ate it slowly, thinking about the days when my wife's voice would come on the phone and say, "Tom, let the tide decide." She'd meant peace, not passivity. I finally understood that, to let the tide decide is not to do nothing. It is to place stones in the water so the current must move differently. The house remained under the trust for a while longer, gardeners hired to keep the lawn alive, the curtains drawn in rooms that remembered laughter. I walked the bluff and sometimes talked out loud to the ocean, telling it things I could not say to my daughter. Sometimes I read from my wife's notebook and tried to be the man she would have recognized, principled, careful, and stubborn in the defense of what's right. The execution had been done. Now the work of aftermath, repair, remorse, slow reconciliation began. The ocean softened again in late spring. The rain slowed, the air turned sweet with pine and salt, and for the first time in months, the house didn't echo. Grief never truly leaves, it just stops knocking so loudly. The court hearings were done. The accounts were closed. The investigators had moved on to newer cases with fresher scandals. What remained was silence, and the smell of coffee brewing the way my wife used to make it, too strong, too honest. I still talked to her sometimes. Out loud, when no one could hear. You'd laugh at me for the way I plan everything now. I told the photo on the mantel. Even the waves couldn't undo it this time. The sea outside looked calm, almost polite. It had witnessed the whole story, every storm, every lie, every redemption that came too late. Maybe that's why I stayed here. The water remembers, but it doesn't judge. It just keeps arriving. Emily called once a week now. Short, careful conversations. She asked about the garden, about the cat, about the weather. Never about the house. Sometimes I caught a new tone in her voice, softer, less certain. The arrogance had burned off like fog. In its place was something I hadn't heard since she was little: humility. Maybe even shame, though she never said the word. "Dad," she said one evening, "I started volunteering at the hospice center downtown. It's strange seeing people at that stage. Makes you think about what you ran from." "That's good," I said quietly. "Helping where it hurts is the only kind that counts." She was silent for a while, then asked, "Do you hate me?" I thought about that question longer than I wanted to. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you. I hate what you did. There's a difference." The line stayed open. I could hear her breathing, steady and small. "I'm trying to be better," she whispered. "I know," I said. "That's the work." The trust stayed in place until the end of summer. When the final papers came, they didn't feel like victory, just closure on paper. I had the right to keep the house. Emily kept her share of her mother's savings, monitored and honest this time. I didn't sell. Instead, I fixed the windows, repainted the shutters, and replanted the flower beds my wife had loved. The garden came back in color: lavender, hydrangeas, white roses by the porch. One afternoon, I found one of my wife's old notes in a cookbook. "Don't let this place turn into a museum. Let it breathe." So I opened the windows, let the sea air in, and realized she hadn't meant the house. She'd meant me. People sometimes ask if revenge was worth it. I tell them there was no revenge, only the correction of a story that had gone wrong. Real revenge isn't about destruction. It's about balance. About watching deceit collapse under its own weight, and realizing you didn't have to swing harder, you just had to hold your ground. The day the last legal letter arrived, I didn't pour a drink or celebrate. I walked down to the bluff and scattered the final bouquet from my wife's grave into the tide. The petals drifted out, pink and white, small against the gray sea. It felt like punctuation, a period, not an exclamation. If you'd asked me a year ago what I believed in, I would have said fairness, maybe family. Those words are softer now. I believe in truth, the kind that doesn't always comfort but always cleans. I've learned that silence can be both a wound and a weapon. When used right, it's either. It's space for the truth to echo. Emily and I aren't what we were, but we're not enemies either. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes healing isn't about return, it's about distance filled with understanding. Last week, she visited. No lawyers, no tension. Just her. She brought groceries and a pie she'd baked herself, burned crust, too much sugar. Her mother's recipe, almost. We ate in the kitchen while the rain tapped against the window. She looked around and said, "It feels different here." "It is," I said. "So are we." When she left, she hugged me. Not out of obligation, but something real. The kind of hug that says, I remember who I was. I'm sorry for it. I'm trying. After she drove off, I sat on the porch until dusk. The tide was rising, the gulls were calling, and for the first time since the hospital, I didn't feel angry. Just tired in a peaceful way. I thought of my wife's last words. Is she coming? And I realized the answer had finally changed. Yes. In her own way, after all this time, she was. The plane of grief had finally landed. The sea, relentless and forgiving, kept breathing against the shore. Revenge hadn't healed me, but it had cleared the fog. And in the quiet that followed, I could finally hear something else, not the sound of justice, but the whisper of peace. If this story moved you, please support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment with your thoughts. To continue the journey, click the box on the left for the next story. Thank you for being here.